Hello, class, and welcome back. I hope everyone's doing well, safe, and healthy. Today, we're going to wrap up our discussion of culture and the economy by looking at an ethnographic case study, some research done right here in New York City. The article by Philip Bourgeois that's in the textbook, which I strongly recommend that you read. The article is called Confronting the Restructuring of Capitalism in El Barrio. It's an ethnography of working poor Puerto Rican crack dealers in Spanish Harlem here in New York City. And it's from his book called In Search of Respect, which you can see here. In doing this ethnography here in the city, Bourgeois faced a number of barriers to beginning his research, which perhaps you, as mostly native New Yorkers, will be able to appreciate. The first barrier to doing this research, which you'll read about, was that the crack dealers that Bourgeois wanted to study suspected that he was an undercover police officer. They thought he was a cop. Until the cops roughed up Bourgeois, they kind of beat him up a little bit because the cops mistakenly thought that Bourgeois was a crack dealer himself. When the crack dealers discovered that Bourgeois was not an undercover cop, his future informants called him, in their words, a pussy, and then they mugged him. So after being roughed up, being mugged and insulted, Bourgeois was finally able to enter and be accepted by the community that he studied and that we are going to talk about today. The Bourgeois article is concerned with the questions of how race and ethnicity, of how class and gender affect a person's position within a capitalist economy. Bourgeois is also concerned with how all of these things are connected to cultural ideas of proper and appropriate respect. By situating crack dealers within the larger capitalist economy and by analyzing that economy within its cultural and historical contexts, Bourgeois importantly tries to move us beyond the usual explanations for poverty that blame the victim, and he instead asks us to focus on the larger cultural and structural issues and problems that are behind these social problems. And that is what we are going to be talking about and what we're going to be thinking about today. The first question that Bourgeois asks in this article is, what is the relationship between crack dealers in New York City and what he calls, quote, mainstream American values? Are the Puerto Rican crack dealers against America and against American values, as they are usually portrayed by politicians and in the media? No, Bourgeois argues that they are not. He argues instead that rather than rejecting mainstream values, working poor drug dealers are actually, in their own way, pursuing a variation of the American dream, which is upward mobility through hard work by selling a product in a marketplace. Why then, we have to ask, are they working hard to sell an illegal product rather than making a living through mainstream employment? Let's find out. The drug dealers that Bourgeois writes about are members of a socioeconomic class called the working poor. Who are the working poor? Are they people who have never in their lives worked regular jobs? No, Bourgeois tells us. They have and do work regular jobs, hold regular employment all the time. But they are a group of people who face a very limited set of life choices. What choices do the working poor have? In the community that Bourgeois studied in Spanish Harlem, those choices were between working a minimum wage job that does not pay enough money to survive on, and between dealing drugs. Bourgeois stresses that these are both bad alternatives. However, in contrast to minimum wage employment, drug dealing is a multi-million-dollar business. And from this chart, we can see that the drug dealers would, I guess, be the 26% voluntary part-time workers among the working poor. Bourgeois explains the specific reasons why these two bad alternatives are really the only options available for the working poor that he studied in New York City. One of the primary reasons why the working poor face such a limited set of options is that over the past 50 years, the country, the United States, has gone through a major economic transformation. This has been the transformation from manufacturing to what we could call service sector employment. This transition has also been a transition from decent paying factory jobs, which have mostly disappeared, to low wage work in an office. Those are the options now available if you're a member of the socioeconomic group that he studied. And Bourgeois shows how this transition has been not only very economically disruptive for the working poor Puerto Ricans in New York City, but it has also been very culturally disruptive. How has it been culturally disruptive? Because, to start, it has involved a humiliating set of racial and class confrontations that the Puerto Rican community did not have to endure before this transition took place. People in the Puerto Rican community in New York City that Bourgeois studied formerly worked in factories. They had factory jobs, meaning they were not lazy. You have to work hard when you're working in a factory. Factory work offered decent wages and was often more attractive than going to school. So many people dropped out of school in order to work in the factories, because to work in the factories, a high school diploma was not necessary. This is a problem, and this is in fact one of the reasons why we have a social class of the working poor, because since the 1960s, over 500,000 factory jobs have left New York City and have left the New York City area. There used to be hundreds of thousands of decent paying factory jobs in and around New York City. What were those factories? Now, Bourgeois doesn't tell us in his article, but since most of you are from New York City, I'm guessing some of you might know. And if we were in class, I could ask you, but we can't, sadly. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is just to give you an example of some of the type of factory jobs that used to be here. The garment district in Manhattan is one example of the type of factory that used to be in New York City. New York City was once the center of clothing manufacturer for the entire United States. And the garment district in Manhattan was the physical location for where most of the clothing that people in the US wore was made. Similarly, the meatpacking district produced most of the meat that was eaten in the city and in the nearby region. These factories are now all or almost all gone. Where did the factories go? In the example of meatpacking, those factories moved to the United States South or to the Midwest, say North Carolina or Omaha, Nebraska, far away from the city, terrible commute from New York. Clothing manufacturer moved to places like Central America and South Asia, to countries where factories could legally pay much lower wages than they could pay or would have to pay here in the United States. When these factories were still in New York City, they provided a livable wage for their workers. And now that they are gone, nothing comparable has replaced them. In addition to providing decent wages, Bourgeois tells us that there was also a cultural fit or a kind of cultural overlap between the working environment of the factory and what he calls the, quote, street culture of the Puerto Rican community. What was the relationship between the street culture and the factory culture? The two were similar and the two overlapped because, for one thing, both valued being tough or being macho. And in a unionized factory, and all these factories that left the United States were unionized, the union bosses expected a certain degree of opposition to the union hierarchy from the workers. So, in other words, you could stand up to your bosses in a factory job and not be punished for it. In fact, the factory bosses even encouraged that kind of oppositional behavior. Of course, it was also important that this was the fact that you didn't need a high school diploma to get a decent factory job. Where do the working poor without high school diplomas work now? They work in office jobs in downtown Manhattan, where the oppositional street culture conflicts, to put it mildly, with the culture of the entry-level jobs that are the only office jobs the working poor Puerto Ricans are qualified for. The working poor often lack the professional skills demanded by the office jobs, yet these are the best available legal jobs to have replaced the factory jobs which have all disappeared. Unlike in the factory jobs, in an office job, you cannot stand up to or talk back to your boss. And furthermore, when the office supervisors are women, this also conflicts with what Bourgeois calls the street culture, because in this Puerto Rican street culture, men are not supposed to be subordinate to women. Bourgeois argues that this represents a major cultural change for the Puerto Rican community that he studied. Also, a major cultural change from where people lived and worked when they were in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, Bourgeois tells us, people lived in a culture where there was an expectation of mutual respect between workers and their bosses, an expectation of mutual respect. In New York City, however, entry-level Puerto Rican workers in the office jobs that they now hold are routinely humiliated and disrespected. So, where can they find the respect that they feel they're accorded to? They find that that culture of respect still continues to exist in the illegal economy of dealing drugs. The working poor are poorly educated. Even if they did graduate from high school, they probably were in a neighborhood that didn't have good schools. They probably couldn't go to a good school. So even if they have a high school diploma, they're probably fairly poorly educated. However, the fact that they are poorly educated does not explain everything. Bourgeois argues that being successful in an office job is actually less about education and the kind of credentials, educational credentials that you hold, and more about a kind of cultural or interactional style that you present. This is an argument that recalls Deborah Tannen's article, which we read earlier in the semester. What was Deborah Tannen's article about? You'll remember Tannen argued that gendered differences in communication, differences between the way men and women speak, lead to misunderstandings and crosstalk between men and women. Bourgeois is making a very similar argument here, except now, instead of gender, the main differences in interactive or cultural style are now based on class and ethnicity. The working poor, the Puerto Ricans, have a different conversational and interactional style based on their language, their heritage, their socioeconomic class, and these styles conflict with the interactive styles of their ethnically white and white-collar middle-class bosses in their new office jobs, which pay them also very badly. So these questions of different cultural styles or different interactive styles present something of a dilemma to the people trying to succeed in these new terrible office jobs. One possible solution to this cultural dilemma that's faced by the working poor Puerto Ricans in the office jobs is that, as Bourgeois argues, they can try to become bicultural, meaning that they can try to strategically shift their identities while on the job to act in a manner that's more culturally acceptable to their white-collar bosses in the office. However, there are a couple of problems with this strategy. One of the problems that people encountered if they tried to become bicultural was that they could end up feeling or being rejected back in their home community for, quote, betraying their authentic culture and betraying their community. And this, therefore, meaning they had a stigma attached to them back at home for trying to act more white, as it were, on the job. In addition, this strategy is basically just kind of a hassle that a lot of the office workers wanted to avoid. So the working class and working poor Puerto Ricans face a number of different cultural barriers when trying to move into the new low-paying office jobs that are now the best jobs available to them. And Bourgeois argues that these cultural barriers were more important for the inability of the working poor to successfully move into office work than their relative lack of education was. Their cultural barriers more important than their lack of education. What again are the cultural barriers that they face? The cultural barriers that they face include the fact that they are humiliated on the job for how they speak and how they act. They face casual racism from their white office bosses. Bourgeois also points out that racism from white people isn't the only problem that the Puerto Ricans face. In New York City society, they also face discrimination for being Puerto Rican from Mexicans and from Mexican Americans as well. They get hit by both sides. Furthermore, on the cultural side, the oppositional street culture of the working poor male Puerto Ricans conflicts with the white-collar office culture, which does not allow any opposition to authority at all. Additionally, men feel gendered threats to their masculinity when their supervisors are female, and the solution, or one solution to all this, the solution of becoming bicultural, is, for a number of reasons, difficult to successfully put into practice. So that's all the cultural side of the equation. The cultural side is just one side of the equation. The larger question we're trying to ask here is, why do working poor Puerto Ricans turn to selling drugs? The cultural side is one part. Now we have to turn to the next part, which is equally as important. There are also structural factors involved in explaining the limited set of options available to the working poor. This is the second half of the equation that I'm trying to spell out for you. By structural explanations, we're talking about the economic, the political, the legal, and the institutional factors that shape society and that are larger than any single individual. Structurally, over the past 50 years, the poor or working class people are becoming more irrelevant to the economy as the basis of the economy has moved from manufacturing into financial services and the larger service sector. One example of a structural factor is the loss of 500,000 factory jobs over the past several decades, just here in New York City alone. In addition to the decline of factory jobs, another structural factor is that since the 1980s, or even before that, the real value of the minimum wage has fallen. What this means is that in 1980, which was a little before Bourgeois began his research, the minimum wage as measured in constant 2012 dollars was the equivalent of $8.46 an hour. However, by 1990, the real value of the minimum wage had fallen to just $6.66 measured in 2012 dollars. It then, by 2012, then rose slightly to $7.25. However, to put all that in perspective, in 1968, when the real value of the minimum wage was at its historic high point, as measured in 2012 dollars, in 1968, the value of the minimum wage was $10.55. So there's been a steady decline over the decades, with slight exceptions, in the value of the real wage, of the minimum wage, in the value of how much people are paid. This decline in the minimum wage, importantly, is not the result of the laws of nature or even of the laws of economics. This decline is, importantly, the result of intentional legal and political decisions that are made on the part of our elected officials. Politicians could easily decide just to raise the minimum wage, but this has proven to be very difficult in our society. So this decline, not natural, highly political, based on laws as they're written by members of Congress, is another example of a structural factor that has created the class of the working poor. The larger question that Bourgeois asks here, and his answer is very important, the question is, why do the working poor Puerto Ricans who he studied turn to dealing drugs? The reasons are both structural and cultural. On the structural side, dealing drugs simply offers better wages than working in a terrible minimum wage job in an office. On the cultural side, importantly, dealing drugs provides more personal dignity and a greater sense of respect than being humiliated at an office job, even if that is at the cost of higher levels of violence and possible imprisonment for dealing illegal drugs. Bourgeois argues that drug dealing is a kind of resistance to the minimum wage service sector jobs. However, he points out, as a mode of resistance, it is a rather self-destructive one, because you can end up either dead or in prison. The larger problem is that politicians and also mainstream society, and even the drug dealers themselves, all ignore these structural and cultural factors and instead blame individuals, and they blame individual behavior for a problem that is much larger than any individual. And I can't repeat enough how important that insight is. The common idea is that these problems, the root causes of these problems, are individuals and individual behavior. And what Bourgeois is showing us is that that's not true, that there are these larger structural and cultural factors, bigger than any individual, which are much more important. Now, I need to point out here that this idea that the root causes of social problems, such as poverty or drug dealing, that the root causes of these problems can be traced to individuals or individual behavior or especially individual psychology. This idea is one of the most dominant ideologies of Western capitalist society. What is a dominant ideology? A dominant ideology is the ideas or the manner of thinking characteristic of a dominant group or social class in society, a group of people that generally has the power to create and affect political and economic policy in a society. These ideas are ideas that are highly resistant to being challenged because they are institutionalized in society through the media, through schools, through just the general way that we talk about the world in ways that we just take for granted. Are dominant ideologies usually true statements about the world? Sometimes they can be, but often they're not. Often they have no real truth value. Is the dominant ideology that the causes of social problems can be traced primarily to individuals a true statement? The answer to that question is no, it absolutely is not a true statement. Why? Because as we've seen in this class and as Bourgeois teaches us in his chapter, there are important and unavoidable structural and cultural factors that are beyond the control of any individual. And those structural and cultural factors are much more significant in creating these social problems. This last point is very important to understand because the ideology that individuals are primarily the people to blame for social problems works, it functions as a smokescreen to hide these larger structural and cultural causes of social problems like racism and poverty. If you just blame individuals, you can't see or are less likely to notice the fact that a company can just decide to move its factory to El Salvador with no penalty whatsoever, and in fact may even be encouraged by the government to do so. If we only focus analysis on individuals and on individual behaviors, that makes it much easier to ignore these larger, important structural and cultural causes, which are difficult to see in the first place. At this point, I could go on and start talking about neoliberalism and some of the specific legal changes that have happened over the past 40 years that have made this whole story possible. I'm going to hold off on that. It's better we do that after the second midterm. Our next class will be a review session for the second midterm exam, and I'll put more information up about that on Blackboard. I'm going to stop here, and I'll see you next time. I hope everyone is doing well. Stay safe, stay healthy, take good care of yourselves. Okay, see you next time.